Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Today, we're going to talk about risk analysis and analytics using Safran Risk. My name's Ian Nicholson. I'm VP Solutions at Emerald Associates. I am a risk analysis trainer and consultant. I've done risk analysis, schedule and cost risk analysis in a number of industries. I actually started using risk analysis on cost estimates using at risk in 1997, and I started working with schedule risk analysis when my company became the Canadian PERTmaster reseller in 2001. I'll try and add some of my insights into the way the tools operate as we go through the discussion today. As I mentioned before, if you joined in the last few minutes, please feel free to put any questions you may have in the questions section on the chat area, and we'll make sure we get them answered at the end of the session. Joining me today is Mary Lynn Backstrom. Mary Lynn is in Edmonton, Alberta. She's got 30 years project controls experience, and she does a lot of work with risk analysis for a number of different industries, and she's an expert in particularly the shutdown turnaround industries. So why do we conduct risk analysis? Well, risk analysis helps our project teams and executives understand and manage the risks on the project. Gets them looking at the challenges of the project and gets them focused on the right issues. There's a lot of noise in a project. There's a lot of things coming at you. And sometimes the project team gets focused on the wrong things. And risk analysis helps them focus on the items that are likely to come back and be an issue in the project. One of the things that we talk about when we teach project managers, particularly when we're talking about scheduling, is we talk about critical path, and you got to worry about your critical path. The problem is we do such a good job of managing the critical path that everyone's surprised when it's no longer the critical path. So risk analysis helps us understand which of our near critical paths might come back and cause us grief during the life of the project. Now, it is a requirement of many companies' gate approval process to do risk analysis, but that's not why you should be doing it. You should be out doing it to understand what's going on in the project. And more recently, the way the industry has been going is we want to understand the dependencies between cost and schedule. Now, this has always been a bit of a challenge because doing cost risk analysis in a schedule risk analysis tool is a lot of work, and doing schedule risk analysis in a cost analysis tool is virtually impossible unless you build your own scheduling engine in Excel. So what we want to do is we want to really understand what's the likelihood we're going to be on schedule and on budget on this project, because achieving one and not the other does not lead to a successful project. I'm in Alberta, Canada. We have a large oil and gas industry here in our province. And there's a group called the Construction Owners Association of Alberta, and they produce construction reports on a regular basis. Way back in 2009, they identified that project risk assessment has been shown to significantly reduce project cost growth. So ask yourself, do you build detailed CPM schedules? Do you develop detailed cost estimates? Well, of course you do. But our projects still aren't being completed on time and on budget. So how can this be? Well, we do detailed CPM scheduling, but there's a problem. And the problem is that our data is entered as finite values rather than ranges of uncertainty. So we'll look at it and say, okay, that task is going to take 4 days, 3 people, $100 an hour. And we come up with a number. And then that number gets carried through our entire cost estimate in our schedule. The problem is that those assumptions may change over time. Maybe all the assumptions are that we're building our project in the middle of summer, and it turns out the project gets delayed, and now we're building it in the winter. Maybe those assumptions don't match reality. Maybe our productivity is going to be lower. Maybe our materials are going to be inferior, and there's going to be a lot of rework. All these things change. The other thing that changes is the project often changes, particularly when we have fast-track projects. The scope, the time, the conditions of the project can significantly change from budget approval to start of construction. We do detailed estimating, but sometimes our estimates are too optimistic or too pessimistic. One of the big challenges of an open bid process is it encourages people to be aggressive, which sounds like a good idea until people are overly aggressive, and then the project can't be completed within the bid process value. Sometimes the opposite happens. Estimators add their own contingency. We've all been on projects where we've had a contingency line item and somebody's taken it away. So people hide contingency in various places. Sometimes estimates are built on historical experience that's no longer valid. And sometimes they're based on projects which are much smaller or larger than the project we're actually constructing, and they don't necessarily linearly scale. So all these items are deterministic. So what does deterministic mean? Well, it means we have a single point value. That doesn't take uncertainty into account, and our uncertainties can build on one another to make the current project very different from what was originally envisaged. There's uncertainty in everything that we do. You know, I can't tell you exactly how long it's going to take me to get to work every day, at least when I used to drive to the office every day. Some days it would take me 15 minutes. Some days it would take me half an hour. Some days it would take an hour, depending on the weather and construction and everything else. Um, and there's really no easy way to model cost uncertainties with our schedule. So that's always been a big challenge. So we have this disconnect between our models. And what we really need is a probabilistic cost and schedule risk model. Now, going back to the Construction Owners Association of Alberta, what they're saying is on average, mega projects in this province, and that's projects over $1 billion, experienced a 19% project cost growth and a 17% project schedule growth. Now, we all know that cost and schedule are intrinsically linked. So why would we treat them as being completely separate entities when we're doing our risk analysis? So here's what we need. We need to be able to model our schedules and our costs more accurately. We need to limit our financial exposure. We need reproducible results. So when we go back and look at our risk analysis a few years later, we understand what we did. We need to improve the likelihood of a successful project. We need confidence in the results and in the budgets that we're working with. We need buy-in from our team members. We need to increase our maturity in conducting risk analysis. And finally, we need everything in one place so we can always go back and look at it again. In the days when I used to work with PertMaster and then Primavera Risk Analysis, we would always have many, many files. Every time somebody wanted to do a different scenario, we'd create a new file. And then months later, trying to find those files and figure out which file was which was always a nightmare. So Safran Risk has been out for a few years now, and it's a great solution to these problems. It lets you put ranges on estimates. It lets you model risk events. It lets you model our costs and schedule together, which is very powerful. It lets you put in logic uncertainty, and it really helps us to understand what's going to happen on our project, understand what's driving our project. It lets us run different scenarios and mitigation strategies and understand exactly where we're likely to end up. I recently did a risk analysis on a project where we ended up running about 5 different scenarios, all trying to understand how we could complete the project on time. We didn't look at cost in that particular example, but the challenge was there was a number of risks that just kept blowing out our end date. And the project team was quite surprised when the initial model showed that the probability of finishing the project by the deterministic end date was less than 1%. But when we dug into it and we looked at all these risks, it became pretty clear what was driving it, and therefore we did a number of different scenarios. So let's dive in. I'm gonna walk through the tool. I'm gonna use a simple project. It's a fairly generic project, and it probably isn't the same as the projects that you would have, but we can never make one sample project that's suitable for everybody. So I will walk through the tool. I'll talk about the different features, and we'll get a chance to really get a good feel for how it works. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so when I come into Safran Risk, the first thing I see is a home screen. And what this system does is it shows me Recent projects that I worked in, it lets me create a new project, open an existing project, import a Safran project, a Primavera XCR, or a Microsoft project file. So any of those things are available to me. Most people, at least in my part of the world, will be working with Primavera XCR files, so I can just import those in. The other thing is you'll notice there's a number of tabs across the top of the screen. So right now the number of tabs is fairly limited. I've got my a tab for my global risks. So I can define globally the risks that are likely to happen on my projects, which is very useful if I have a number of similar projects, because I can define these risks once and then I can apply them across multiple projects. I can define risk calendars. And again, the same idea, I can define my probabilistic calendars and I can then apply those across all of my projects. So if I'm doing a number of projects, say in the Gulf of Mexico, they're pretty much going to all be impacted, during storm season. So I can make one probabilistic calendar and I can assign it to all of my projects as required. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the home screen. I'm just going to open this simple project, which is a UAV, an unmanned air vehicle project. When I open the project, what the system does is it takes me to the Gantt chart view. Now, this is a typical Gantt. It's nothing too sophisticated. It's not that big a project. It's got about 50 activities in it. One of the nice things about Safran is that it's built on Safran Project, which is a tool like P6. Now, Primavera never built a tool for risk analysis right in P6, which leads us to the situation we have today where we're always using XCRs and moving data around. But once I've got my project in Safran, I can make different layouts, I can create filters, I can flip between my views, I can do all of the sort of things that I would do in P6 because it's a fully featured scheduling tool. So this is quite useful because if I would need to make a couple changes, maybe to logic and rerun the analysis, I don't have to go back to P6, make the changes and re-export and import the file. Now, and when I'm doing this, I'm going to work from left to right. So the workflow in Safran is pretty much that I start on the left and I work my way right as I go. So the next tab I have is my Schedule Warnings tab. And the Schedule Warnings tab just warns me about anything that might be an issue on my project. So this is like the schedule check report that they have in Primavera Risk Analysis. It checks for the same kind of things. There is, by the way, a full DCMA 14 point check option module on here that you can add if you want to do a more thorough check. But the checker that comes with the tool out of the box checks all the things that you'd be concerned about when doing a risk analysis. So it tells me, for example, that I've got a project start milestone with no predecessors. Well, I kind of expected that. I've got a project completion milestone with no successors. Again, pretty much what I expect. Then it tells me I've got this activity 3070 that's an open end with no predecessors, no successors, and it's constrained. Well, that's kind of odd. So I'm just going to click on that and it'll take me right to that activity. And I can take a look and see if that activity is in fact something that I need to worry about. In this case, I'm not quite sure how it got there. I don't want it. So I'm just going to delete that activity out of my schedule. Then when I go back to the schedule warnings, it's disappeared. It automatically refreshes. So now I can see I'm good to move on. Now the next tab we're going to go to is the Project Risks tab. Now for those of you that used Primavera Risk Analysis, we used to have a module called the Risk Register. And in the Risk Register, you would put in your risk events, but for the uncertainties, you would either have to go to the individual activities, or there was a module that you could use where you could put them in, but it was really underdeveloped, and so nobody really used it. So ultimately what happened was we ended up having to go and on each activity and put uncertainties in. The module was called Risk Factors. Now, with Safran, they've changed that. They said, okay, what could we do to make this easier? I mean, the guys who work on Safran used to all work for PertMaster. So they kind of looked at this from the perspective of if we were starting all over again, what would we do differently? What lessons did we learn over the last 20 years? And one of them was, let's put all of the risks in one place. So what they have is they have this module called Project Risks, and all of your risks and all of your uncertainties go into this module. Now, for any particular risk, I can define the probability of occurrence, and then I can define the impact on schedule as well as the impact on cost. Now, those can be different. So in this case, I've got two different distribution shapes. And those impacts can be relative or they can be absolute. So a relative impact would be a percentage of the original activity or cost line item. An absolute impact would actually be an impact where you define exactly how many days or how many dollars that impact is going to be. Now, the next thing is that I can define similar information for a post-mitigated position. So in the post-mitigated side, what I can do is I can define a different schedule impact, I can define a different cost impact, and if I want to, I can also go in and put in the steps I'm going to take to get from my pre-mitigated position to my post-mitigated position. And I can add activities and costs to represent that work. So if I decide to mitigate this risk, I'm going to, this is the flight corridors closed due to ash cloud. Maybe what I'm going to do is I'm going to see if I can move the testing somewhere else. So I'm going to go out and I'm going to search for a different test site where I don't have to worry about an ash cloud shutting down my testing. So in that case, I need another activity for the time I'm going to spend looking for that location and for the dollars I'm going to spend to find that and secure that location. So I can put those in the model. So again, when you're doing your analysis, you can also look at your mitigation strategies to see whether they're worth doing or not worth doing. Now, for just general uncertainties, what I can do is I can create just an uncertainty item. And on that uncertainty item, I can, again, define a relative percentage, and I can assign that to any number of activities. So unlike Primavera risk analysis, where I would assign an uncertainty to each activity, here I can assign one uncertainty factor to multiple activities. So this is a bit like, we used to have something called the templated quick risk in Primavera risk analysis, and it would go through and it would assign the risks to the like the percentages to the activities, and that worked okay, except that when you had more than one uncertainty on one activity, the second one would overwrite the first one, which wasn't a good situation. Here, I can assign multiple uncertainties to the same activity, and the system will calculate the cumulative effect, and I'll show that in just a moment. So it's much more powerful because I don't have to sit there myself and figure out what the cumulative impact of a number of uncertainties is on one activity. Finally, I can have my calendar risks in here. So again, rather than what I would do in Primavera risk analysis, where I would go into an individual activity and then I would assign a probabilistic calendar to it, what I'm going to do here is the calendar is a risk, and I assign the activities that risk is associated with. So again, much easier to work with, much more visible, and just a much smoother, easier experience rather than having to go into a number of submenus of submenus of submenus to find out where my probabilistic calendar is and assign it. Now, once I have all of my risks defined, then I go to the next tab, which is my risk mapping. Now, in my risk mapping, what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign all the various risks to the appropriate activities. Now, again, keep in mind that I have uncertainties and I have risk events. So in this case, my uncertainties are on the left side. Anything I described as an estimate uncertainty appears on the left. The difference is you'll notice that there are radio buttons or round selection icons on this side, whereas to the right of that thick bar, they're square. Now, there's a good reason for that, and that's because if I open up my structure here and I choose a particular activity, agree contract in this example, I can't choose more than one of my estimate uncertainties. The system will only let me choose one of them. Whereas on my risk side, I can choose as many as I like. So um, again, I have the option here of defining whether I want it to be my risks to be exclusive or my risks to be cumulative, and then I can assign them appropriately. Now, going back to that particular line item, it will show me on the bottom of the screen. Let me just move this up a little bit. It shows me on the bottom of the screen all of the risks that have been associated with this particular activity. It shows me what their distribution is. And by the way, I can override that distribution if I need to. So, if I don't want the impact to be quite as large, I can always override what came from the project risks module. Me personally, I prefer not to do that because it's one more thing I need to track, but you can if you need to. Now, the other thing it will show me is if I go on the schedule impact tab, it shows me here's all the risks that you've associated with this particular activity. And the overall impact of those risks is shown on the right-hand side. So what it shows me here is this is what my overall distribution shape is going to look like. So it's basically combined all of these, done a little mini risk analysis and said, okay, here's what the distribution shape looks like for this activity. And if I add another risk, for example, if I choose the design risk and add it, it immediately recalculates and shows me the new shape. Now this is really useful. I'll just turn it off again. This is really useful because if I choose an inappropriate risk, like maybe I've got a agree contract is a 2-week activity, and I put a risk on it that's got a 6-month impact. Well, I'm going to show very quickly that I've got this crazy impact way over on the right-hand side of my distribution, and immediately I'll say, well, that doesn't look right. So it lets me find the problems instead of running the analysis and then going back and saying, why did this end up at the top of the tornado and having to track it down? It lets me catch these errors very quickly when I'm doing my assignments. Now, the other thing is I can run filters on this if I need to see a smaller list. When we're running with a large schedule with thousands of activities, or I've got hundreds of risks, it's very useful to be able to filter these. So the system lets me do filters. I can filter on any of my individual items. I can run the filters that I have in the schedule module. They're all available here. I can even run a risk filter. If I want to look for only risks that have communication in them, I can filter down on that as well. So it's very quick and easy to make a smaller list to manage, because when you've got everything turned on, it can be a very large volume of data that you're dealing with. Okay, I'm going to come back to the cost module in just a moment. So even though I said I'm going to work my tabs left to right, I'm going to come back to this one. Let's move on to the correlation tab. Now, again, going back to my days of working with Primavera risk analysis, we used to always have to correlate activities to each other, which was fine as long as you were correlating, say, piling activities, because you could just find all the activities and correlate them together and say, well, if the first piling activity goes bad, chances are all the piling activities are going to go bad. But then I'd run into a problem if I wanted to take all of the activities associated with a particular risk and say, I've got a risk called soil conditions. And what I want to do is I want to assign that risk more broadly, and I want to correlate it more broadly than just those activities done by one discipline. So what the way Safran works is it lets you, I'll just turn off some of the extra fields here. It lets you look at the correlation from the perspective of the risks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to correlate my risks together, which is much easier to do. And I'm going to correlate the probability and then the schedule and or cost impact. And it ends up being a much simpler way of managing correlation, because now instead of linking, 50 piling activities together, all I need to do is go and choose one risk called piling and another risk called soil conditions and tie those two together, and I'm good to go. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about is scripting. So I'm not sure if any of you were power users of Primavera Risk Analysis, but Primavera Risk Analysis used to have the ability to put VB code into the actual model. So you could run different scenarios. If something happens at some point, then I want the model to react differently. So they had a neat example in the sample files that talked about, okay, so we've got this rig and it needs to be completed, and if it's not completed by a certain date, we can complete it in transport, but if it's not beyond a certain percent, we can't complete it in transport. And it was a really neat little model, except that at some point, about 10 years or 8 years ago, Oracle turned that off, the ability to run the VB code. So all of a sudden, these models stopped working, and people who wanted to be able to run those very sophisticated models could no longer do so. So Safran has that in here. It's not VB code, it's JavaScript, but you can put in to your models conditional type items. So you could say, if this occurs, then do that. So it's very powerful. You don't have to use it. You know, for 90% of the users, it's probably a non-issue. But for those real power users with really sophisticated models, it's actually very powerful tool. Okay, so let's move on to analyze. So there's a lot of stuff on the analyze screen. So let's go through. First of all, on the left, we have a list of all of our risks. Now, for each time I run the analysis, I have the option, do I want to include a risk? So maybe I want to turn a risk off completely. I can just uncheck the box and completely remove that risk. The other thing I could do is I could choose to run some of my risks in a pre-mitigated position and some of them in a post-mitigated position. So again, going back to the PRA days, you had to run all pre-mitigated or all post-mitigated. And if you wanted to do scenarios, it was actually fairly difficult. Here, I can just tell the system, in this risk, let's run this in the post-mitigated position, or let's exclude this risk. I was mentioning I was doing a risk analysis a couple of weeks ago for a client, and I felt that they were double dipping on a couple of risks. So to show them, I went in here and I just could turn off what I thought was the duplicate risk and say, this is the way the model looks with that risk off. Here's what it looks like with that risk on. It was very easy to do. So yeah, I really like that. And I think it's a very powerful thing to do when you're trying to walk through a model and get people to understand what's going on in the model. Now you have the option in here as well to run Latin hypercube or Monte Carlo sampling. You can include or exclude correlations. You can choose to resource level after each iteration, which is useful for very large resource constrained schedules like turnarounds. You can also choose to step through, and I'll do that in just a moment. The other thing that I like about this is we have this ability to define focus activities and focus costs. So what's a focus activity? Well, a focus activity is some intermediate activity that you really care about. So when I'm doing my risk analysis and I get a schedule from the project team, they send me something, and at the end of the schedule, there's invariably stuff like, you know, handover, warranty, demobilize, site cleanup, all this crap that I don't care about. What I care about is, when is this thing being turned over to the owner? So what I can do is I can take those intermediate points and make them a focus activity, which allows me to get to them more quickly. And when we're doing our analysis, it allows me to choose those and get to them very quickly rather than have to scroll up and down through a list of activities. Similarly, on my focus costs, I can choose a particular cost that I care about and look at what's going on with that particular cost. So maybe I have a cost item for my hotel costs, for example, and what I want to do is I just want to keep an eye on that through the analysis. Well, I can do that just by making it a focus cost. Now, when I actually run the analysis and I do a step through, it just like Primavera risk analysis, it takes you to the Gantt chart. You can step through and you can see if things are moving the way you expect. Very useful tool. You can scroll up and down while you're doing that. So if you want to see what's happening in a particular area, you can. Make sure that all the things you've defined are moving the way you expect. When you get tired of watching that, you can hit complete, and the tool will finish the analysis and take you to your distribution. Just a quick word about that. Primavera risk analysis worked really well with small schedules. Once your schedules got up about 5 to 10,000 activities, it started to chug. If you got more than about 20,000 activities, it ran so slowly that it would inevitably either crash or just never finish. So Safran is much faster. We've done tests on on projects of up to 100,000 activities, and it works quite well. So the performance is much better. It also, because everything's being stored in a database, you're not getting all those crazy files that Primavera Risk Analysis used to create for you. So again, the ability is really nice to have. Now, when I actually get to my distribution, I can drill in to any particular activity that I want. I can take a look at that activity and see what the distribution looks like for that activity. Again, I've got my focus activities. So if I really care about my focus, where my individual focus activities are, I can go and look at those very quickly. And there is another thing here that I really like, and that's where it says data view. So, going back to Primavera risk analysis days, I could always dump my results to Excel, but then I ended up with this huge spreadsheet and I couldn't really understand what was going on. It just had a bunch of values in it. The data view here is actually quite useful. If I click on it, what it does is it shows me for each iteration what the overall, actually, let me go all the way back to my overall project. There we go. Okay, so it shows me for each iteration which of my risks fired, and it also shows me relatively where they ended up. So the color gets to be darker as it becomes a bigger impact, and it turns from green, which is a positive impact, to red, which is a negative impact. So I can see on each iteration exactly which risks happened and how much of an impact that they had. And if I hover my mouse on each box, it will actually give me the exact number. In this case, schedule impact 118%, or cost impact $32,000. So, and now if I want to, what I could do is I can go and say, okay, well, let's sort this by the duration. And let's look at what happened on our worst duration, which was 543 days. And, oh, sorry, that was my best duration on 543 days. And I can see what risks fired, and I can see virtually nothing fired except for this one opportunity I had for outsourcing my project. Now, if I go the other way, if I go to the worst case scenario, which was 918 days, I can see again all of the risks that fired on that iteration as well. So not only can I see what fired to drive things out, but I can even go and click on the iteration and it will show me a read-only view of the Gantt chart in that iteration. So I can actually see at any point in the schedule what things were doing. Now I find this really useful when I'm trying to understand why I had some extreme results. I can go and understand what risks fired, what did the schedule look like when they fired, and I can do some analysis. I'm going to hit close on that. I'm going to go back to the distribution graph and let's flip back to the standard view. The other thing I can do, of course, is I can send this to the comparison. If I want to do a comparison of different scenarios, I can send those things to that comparison, and I'll show you that in just a moment. Of course, we have the tornado. Now, I mentioned before that I really like the idea of the way the system works and the way that everything comes from the project risks. One of the advantages to everything coming from project risks is I can tie my impacts back to what risks are driving the project. Now, in Primavera Risk Analysis, I could see this, but only for risk events. In here, I can see it for risk events and uncertainties. So anything that was in that project risks module is going to show up in this tornado. So now I can see what are the risks that are really driving my project. Now this will help me understand exactly what I need to focus on. And it's giving me a complete view rather than just risk events. Of course, I can still look at it on an activity by activity basis. So I still have that ability as well. Now, the next tab we're going to look at is our sensitivity analysis. So years ago, I was working with a company and it was taking them a really long time to produce risk analysis results. And we were talking about why it took so long. And one of the things that they mentioned, and this is probably 10 years ago, was that they were doing what they called analysis by exclusion. And analysis by exclusion means that when they actually end up looking at their tornado charts, So if I go back to the tornado chart, they were going to the project team and saying, okay, our ash cloud impact is 62% and our testing overrun impact is 46%. Now, those numbers are correlations and they don't really mean anything to the project team. Okay, so 62% is about, one and a half, 1.25 times more than 46%. But other than that, what does that mean? So to answer that question, what they would do in Primavera risk analysis, excuse me, is they would turn off a risk, run the analysis, store the results, turn it back on, turn off the next risk, run it, record the results, turn it back on. And they would do this for all of the items in the top of the tornado, just so they could answer the question, what is the impact to the project of that risk in days or dollars? And they couldn't answer that by just giving a percentage. So they used to manually do this process. Well, Safran does that for you. What it does is it will actually go through, and I'm just going to check my options here, good. And I click calculate impacts. And what it's going to do is it's going to run each of those risks, it's going to turn them all off and then turn them back on. So basically it's automating that manual process. And it was taking this client about a week to do this analysis, and the tool, depending how large your schedule is and how many risks you have, this might take an hour, which you can run it over lunch, but an hour instead of a week is a huge time saving. So in this case, I can say to them, okay, the ash cloud is having a 40-day impact on the project. So rather than say it's 60%, I can now say it's 40 days, which is much more useful information for our project team. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to step back and I'm going to go back to the cost module. Now, I mentioned before that one of the things that we really need to be able to do is understand what is the probability of being on time and on budget. Okay. Now, we call this the JCL, or joint confidence level. So what we really want is when somebody says, I want a 70% probability of project success, they're not saying, I want a 70% probability of being on time, and they're not saying, I want a 70% probability of being on budget. They're saying, I want both of those things, and I want a 70% chance that both of them are going to happen. So in order to do that combination, that joint confidence level, we need to get both in the same model so we can understand for each iteration what was the date we finished on, what was the cost. And we need to be able to do that together. And Safran has this cost module, which makes that a whole lot easier, because in the past, to do that, what we would have to do is we would have to build a cost-loaded schedule that matched our cost estimate. Now, that's a lot of work. You can do it, and plenty of people have, but it's a lot of work to build. And once you build it, when things change, you need to basically build it again. So it's really tedious. So what Safran did is they said, okay, let's allow people to run a cost model and a schedule model independently of each other in the same tool, and then they can create the links as appropriate between those. So what they did was they let us build in here a cost model. So we basically have our cost worksheet in here. And for each of the lines in that cost worksheet, we have the ability to define uncertainties, define risk events around that cost line item. And then if appropriate, we can link that to our schedule. So in this case, what I'm going to do is let me just turn off the schedule component and just talk about the cost risk first. I'll come back to the schedule component. Okay, so the first thing is I've got this base cost. So in this case, my base cost for addition, or let's start with the camera lens, is $1.75 million. Now, that's the number that came from my cost estimate. Now I can put an uncertainty on that if I want to. I can define a cost uncertainty on here. So I could say, okay, I've got some uncertainty distribution, and I can use any number of my different distributions, just like I could back in the risks module. And I can define a relative or absolute impact. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, we'll just put this one in as is. So it's a relative distribution of 80, 100, 150%. So that's good. That works really well. So now I basically built a really simple uncertainty around this number. But what I can also do is I can also assign the risks from the risks module to my line items as well. So what I can do is I can go in here and I can choose any of the risks that I've defined in the risks module that have a cost element associated with them, and I can add them to my risks on this line item. Now I can put as many on as I want to. Again, you can, and the likelihood of occurrence and the shape and everything else is all coming from the risks module. So when I do that, again, if I go down to the bottom of the screen, just like I did with on the activities view, I can look and say, okay, what are the risks associated with this line item, this cost line item? What's the cost impact? And it will show me all of the various cost impacts that I've put on there. And again, here's what my overall distribution shape looks like. So again, I can look at it and say, does this make sense? Does this look like what I expect it to look like? Or is it not correct? Now, the other thing I can do in here is for my base cost, I can define a formula. So sometimes your base cost is made up by certain assumptions, like here's how many hours we're going to need, here's what the cost per hour is going to be, here's what the duration of that work is going to be. I can actually put uncertainties on any of those items by defining, rather than a base cost, by defining a formula. So in this case, I've got a PM cost and I've got a duration, either of which could have uncertainty on it. So again, I can define those and I can build uncertainties into my base number as well. Now, the other thing that I can do here is, once I've got this and I've built it the way I want, now I can choose to associate some portion of these with activities from my schedule. So for example, what I can do here is I could go into, say, for my parts here, and I could say, okay, I want to associate that with an activity. Now, the way it works is I can choose an activity. So in this case, we've got our parts for fuel system. I can go down under fabrication. I've got my fabricate fuel system activity. I could say, okay, this item here, this $2.4 million line item, is linked to this activity. But maybe I don't want all of it to be linked, because we're talking about parts, right? So maybe the amount of time is not 100% driving the parts. Maybe it's only partially driving the parts. So what I can do is I can say only a fraction of that $2.4 million, maybe 25%, is actually being driven by this activity. The remaining 75% is fixed. So what the system does is it says, okay, you had $2.4 million as your base item. That means that 1.8 million is fixed, that being 3/4, and 600,000 is variable. Then what it does is it looks at the duration of the activity, calculates what the cost is per day, and now when I run my analysis, as the duration of that activity changes, so too will my cost change. So that variable $600,000 is going to vary with the duration of the activity. So again, this is really powerful, because now, instead of having to put every single cost in my schedule to get my combined cost and schedule impact, I can only choose the ones that need to be linked to the schedule, and not everyone will. So again, it gives me that flexibility to choose what I want to do. So once I've done that, when I run the analysis, I can actually go to the cost module and I can see what's going on as I go through. And again, these risks will light up as they're happening. It will also show me what the overall cost is on the base. And if I actually go to my columns, I can turn on my overall iteration value. It's right at the bottom. Okay, it is on. So let's move over there. And I can say for each iteration what my cost is for that line item. So essentially what the system's doing is it's adding up all of those risks. It's looking at the formulas to come up with the base numbers. It's looking at the risks that are firing. It's looking at the items that are linked to duration. It's putting all that together and saying on this iteration, here's what the cost was for this line item. Now when I hit complete, I can now go to my distribution graph, but now I can look at it from a cost perspective. And now it shows me here's the overall costs on your project. Okay, so it's taken all of that and it's showing me overall, here's what your costs are looking like for the project. Now, similarly, I can look at the drivers on a cost basis instead of a schedule basis. So what are the things driving my project costs? I can do sensitivity analysis based on cost. And so all the tools that I had around schedule are also available on the from a cost perspective. So I can see all those same things. What's driving my costs? What's my analysis by exclusion look like on a cost basis? So all of those things are available to me. And finally, what I can do is I can look at a scatter plot, and the scatter plot will show me what is the probability of achieving both my cost and schedule. Because each of these points on the scatter plot represents an iteration with a cost and a completion date. So what the system's telling me is I'm about 1% likely to actually achieve my cost and schedule together, my JCL. Now, if I were to look at just the schedule date, you could see here I'm probably sitting at more like about, I don't know, probably about 8 or 10%. If I look at it from a cost perspective, again, I'm probably sitting about 8 or 10%, which overall puts me at a very low percentage. So what do I need to carry to make sure that I get up to that joint confidence level of 70% that I talked about? Well, the system will highlight that scatter plot to show you all the values that were between 50 and 70 and 70 and 80. Now, these ranges are defined by what your focus percentiles are. So if I really want to, I really care about a JCL of 75%, I can tweak that in order to get the values that I want. But essentially, what we're looking at is we're looking at the interface between these two colors. So where it goes from orange to red is pretty much where I'm going to hit my P70 value. So if I were to go on, say, this icon here, we're at 70% and we're finishing on March the 6th at a cost of about $10.5 million. So the other thing I can do is I can actually put those into the system. So I can go in here and I can say my finish date is going to be, say, March the 6th. And my cost was 10.5 million. Okay, so that puts me here at this point at 70%. But I can do a little more than that, because although that is a 70% outcome, that's not the only 70% outcome. I could also be over here, right in this range here. So this particular dot is at 67%. This dot is at 71%. So I could say, you know what? I could carry these numbers. So finish on February the 19th for 11.65 million. So what the system is telling me is, if time is more important than money, you could spend another $1 million and you could finish essentially about 3 weeks earlier. Okay. So that's still getting me a P70 value. But what it's also showing me is the next P70 value is way up here. It's actually slightly more. Let's go to this guy here. So we're at 72%. We spent $16 million. So we've spent like $5 million more, and we've only saved another week. So what's happening is this line goes to be vertical, which basically says you can spend all the money you want, and you're not going to save any more time or any significant more time. Similarly, when that continuum line goes horizontal, it's saying, you know what, you can give up as much time as you want, but you're not going to save any money. So the idea here is between the point where it goes vertical and the point where it goes horizontal is this curve. And anywhere on this curve is going to get me that P70 value. So as a project team, we can decide to trade off cost versus schedule to get to where we need to be. Now, there's a lot of really interesting white papers out there about what point on that continuum should you choose. People call it the JCL necklace because it's a number of points on a string. And as I said, there's some really interesting papers out there about what you should choose. But the important thing here to me is that the project team can understand and make decisions, right? If we spend an extra $500,000, maybe we could save 2 weeks. Is that worth doing? Or is it not worth doing? If time to market is critically important, it probably is. If time to market is not critically important, then it's probably not. Or if the company's in shaky financial situation, you know, what's the best we could do in terms of slowing the project down to save some money? So this is a very powerful tool, and it gives the project team some answers to that question, right? So how are we going to trade those things off? All right, the next thing is that the system will do a probabilistic cash flow. So you can look at where you're likely to end up over time. This is a big deal when people want to look at how much they're going to spend year over year, because the deterministic schedule says we're going to spend X in 2021 and Y in 2022. But when we actually look at our probabilistic cash flow, it could be quite different because the way people or the way that the delay occurs on the project could affect our spend. And I was on a project many years ago where we had to give monthly cash flows to the owner, and we were always telling them we would need more money than we really did because the project kept falling behind, and we weren't going to certify more work than had been done. But they got quite aggravated with us because we said, okay, the spend this month will be $10 million, and then the invoicing would come in for 8, and they would say, that's a 20% difference. We reserved this money and now you're not spending it. So that became a big issue on this particular project. Okay, finally, we can look at a distribution comparison. So we can look on here at different scenarios and understand what those scenarios look like in terms of the amount of time that we're going to spend or save. So in this example here, we ran 3 different scenarios. We had our original plan, and then we had a couple scenarios with different logic, and we were looking at, where do we end up on those different plans and what do they look like. So it's very useful, and you can actually save these and you can rerun them and do all kinds of things with them. You can also create historical information and capture them over time and look at trending and things like that. So it's very powerful. Okay, so we've got about 5 minutes left. I'm going to take some questions. There's some there already. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'm happy to answer them. I'll start with the question section. If somebody puts something in the chat section, I will get to them as well. Okay, so somebody's asking about generating risk calendars from time series. What is the difference between creating calendar samples by using consecutive years and randomly selected years? So that's a very technical question. And the answer is we have the ability, when we actually create our probabilistic calendars, in loading a time series. Now, the way the system works when we load a time series, the idea, this was developed for Statoil Hydro, or whatever they call themselves today, because they ran a whole bunch of rigs in the same fields off Norway. And so the idea was, well, we want to look at if the wind is above a certain amount or the wave height is above a certain amount, we can't work. So what's the probability that's going to be? And they were manually making probabilistic calendars. And then somebody said, we have all this historical information. We've had oil rigs here since the 70s. Why can't we just load that stuff? And so what they did was they allowed you to take a time series from a government agency and load that up and make a and make a probabilistic calendar. Now the thing about that is if your probabilistic or if your historical information isn't as long as your calendar window. So if I got 5 years of data, but I want to extrapolate that to a 10-year window, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to need to use randomly selected years to calculate those. So that's the way it works. If you have more years in your historical data than you're forecasting, then you can use the consecutive years function. So somebody's saying, my schedule is resource loaded, so costs are time phased and come from the schedule. When a schedule risk hits a costed activity, the cost grows according to the activity duration. How can I make all of my activities duration independent? So if you want your activities to be duration independent, you can model them in Safran so that they are independent of duration, but it's a bit technical. If you'd like to reach out to me, we can probably go through that in more detail. I probably don't have time today to get into that, but we can certainly do that. Okay, the next question was the RAND corporate studies IPA found the largest contributor to project risk is systemic risks or risks inherent in the project system. Does Safran allow for the modeling of systemic risk? Well, you can, because you can make those global risks that you can apply to all of your projects. So you have the ability to actually model systemic risks. I agree, that is a big problem, and it's something that can be difficult to do. Can you explain the use of series or parallel risks in the risk mapping? Yeah, so when I actually do the mapping, what I can do is if I choose a particular one, I can actually tell the system that I want those impacts to happen in series or in parallel. And effectively what that means, if they're in series, it means that when they fire, they're all going to extend the activity. Whereas if they're in series, or sorry, if they're in parallel, only the longest one will impact the overall activity. So that's the difference between. Is the correlation between activities not inherent in a quality CPM schedule? I understand that was one of the advantages of doing integrated cost QRA using a cost-loaded CPM. Well, correlation between activities is an issue when you get into the discussion of the central limit theorem. And the central limit theorem basically says if you have a huge number of activities with similar durations, when one goes long, another one's going to go short, and they tend to cancel each other out. So the issue quite often is that, like in my example where I said I've got 50 piling activities, they typically will, they'll typically, activity one goes long, activity two goes short, they cancel each other out, and I end up with a shorter overall distribution than I would otherwise get. Why can the fixed cost part, or why is a fixed cost cannot be set to 0? So so what we're saying here is I think we're asking about the base cost, which can be 0. Or maybe we're asking about the fixed cost. Well, if we're asking about the fixed cost here, it can't be 0, because if it was 0, you just wouldn't link it to the activity, I guess is the answer. Again, I hope I'm answering that question in full. If not, please reach out to me. Can the tool plot a regression line at any given JCL percent? Not currently, but that is an enhancement request, and they're actually in this coming next release, or possibly the release after, they are going to add a lot of analysis around those scatter plots and the JCLs. So that is something that's coming. In the meantime, if anybody's interested in people who have done that sort of thing, I have some white papers that have been provided to me by the authors that talk about that, and I'm happy to share those if you want to reach out to me. Is it possible to upload P6 or Microsoft project schedules in Safran? Yeah, absolutely. You can, MS project files get loaded up using the XML format, and P6 using the XCR format. If you want to take the project back to Primavera, can this be done? And would it take the cost as well? So the answer to that is it can be done. You can create an XCR file. What you won't get going back is the project risks or the risk mappings. So the activities themselves will go back, and if you want to take the outputs of your model as user-defined fields back into Primavera, you can do that as well. But the risk data itself won't go back to Primavera. Can you obtain critical path lists sorted by the highest duration/cost activities? You can, because you can get your risk outputs back into the schedule module, and then you could do the sorting that way. So if you wanted to do that, you could. Let's see, this is a question here. Will the slide deck be available offline? We're going to make a video of this available, assuming that the quality is decent. As Shannon said in the comments, they'll be sending the recording out. So if there's anything that you would like to see, you should be able to review it. Do you recommend building a simple model or a heavy project schedule? Oh, no, you're going to get me in trouble here. So my preference is always to work with the schedule that this project team is using. That is a personal preference. A lot of people feel differently in that they prefer to work with a higher level schedule than the project team is working, and they build a schedule specifically for risk analysis. The reason I like to do this, and again, this is my personal view, is that I really want to make sure that the schedule and cost elements, for that matter, are exactly what the project team is working with. So they can't say, well, that's your schedule, it's not my schedule. So I don't want to hear that comment. I want them to have buy into the inputs, so they'll buy into the outputs. Someone commented they like the JCL plot. Yeah, I do too. Can the data be exported for use in a customer's PRA tool and vice versa? You can, using the Primavera export format, both tools will export to XCR, but again, you may lose the risk items. What I have done in the past is I've actually exported the risks from Primavera Risk Analysis and then used the import export to bring them back into Safran. So Safran has a very robust Excel import-export functionality, which makes it very easy to put things in and out. I think we've answered all the questions. There's a couple that I had to go over fairly quickly, so let me just finish up here. So there's customers all over the world using this tool. It's a great tool, has a lot of flexibility. Wrong way. There we go. If you have any other questions, or if I didn't answer your questions to your satisfaction, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is on the screen, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Our contact information, our phone numbers are there as well, but the best way to get me is via email. There's also a lot of information on our website about Safran Risk, along with some blog articles I've written about why people should move from Primavera Risk Analysis to Safran. And if you also go to Safran's website, they have a great learning guide, which has blogs, my blogs, and blogs by a number of very experienced people talking about why Safran is a good choice for you. Okay, so I think at that point we've answered all the questions. Again, if I missed anything, if you didn't get your question answered to your satisfaction, please feel free to reach out to me. And with that, we're a couple minutes late. I guess we should have allowed some contingency, but we'll stop at this point. Thank you very much.